Protracted Passage by C Heseltine. At the age of 14, in 1897, I joined as an apprentice the full-rigged ship Blackbraes, in which I was to spend 5 years, leaving her as third mate after the expiration of my indentures in 1901. The Blackbraes, a painted port vessel, was owned by Potter Brothers of London. In those apprenticeship days, I kept a diary which has long ago been lost, but my memory serves well enough to enable me to give an account of that long voyage, my second in the Blackbraes, when we sailed in June 1899 from South Shields, where we loaded a cargo of pig iron, coke, marble and fire bricks for San Francisco. In command was Captain Graham, who had served as an apprentice officer and in command on the Calcutta run of the Brocklebank line, carrying jute to Dundee. The first mate, Mr. Lindsay, had plenty of experience of Cape Horn weather. There were 4 apprentices on this voyage, but I recollect the names of only 2, Goodban and Roberts. Captain Graham carried his wife with him, and her presence on board, though perhaps a good thing in some ways, did not work well for me, at least for the first part of the voyage. 2 weeks out of port, the steward began drinking heavily and became incapable of doing his work. This might have been rectified by finding his store of liquor and throwing it overboard, but the master's wife took a dislike to him and insisted he be dismissed from his work, which was of course carried on in the poop, next to the captain's quarters. Thereupon the captain sent for me, and realising, I suppose, that I was an indentured apprentice, asked me specially to oblige him by acting as steward as far as San Francisco, promising to recompense me when we reached there. This put me in an awkward situation. I knew from the mate, to whom I turned for advice, that in the face of my apprentice indentures the old man could not insist. On the other hand, for a youngster of 16 to be asked to take over the work and responsibility of a ship's steward seemed then to be something of a compliment. The mate told me I had better consent, and thus I was put in the full charge of all the food, weighing and rationing it out to the crew, was responsible for serving out the fresh water daily, arranging meals for the captain and mates, and giving the cook his orders. I had been told that the difference between a sailor and a steward could be seen by watching them when they stepped out on deck. The sailor would look aloft at the weather and sails, while the steward would look at the deck to see if he would get his feet wet. And I was determined not to be that sort of a steward. The man whose place I took was reduced to ordinary seaman and relegated to the forecastle. As steward I found I was friend of no man. Aft I was blamed if the meals were not good. Forward I was blamed because the rations were too small. I tried to vary the cabin food with tinned beef and mutton, but the mates swore both these were horse. Quite likely they were right. By September the 1st, 1899, the Blackbraes was in the latitude of the Falkland Islands. On approaching the Cape, the weather at first appeared favourable, but once off the Horn it changed, and continual strong gales from the NW prevented the vessel from making much westerly headway. She wallowed along under lower topsails and storm spanker, making a southerly more than a westerly direction until she was in nearly 60 degrees south. The master did not care to go any farther south for fear of icebergs, so the ship tacked north again, still unable to make a westerly course because of the howling gales from that quarter. This went on day after day, with tremendous seas continually washing right over the vessel. It may be thought that I was better off as steward than on deck, but this was not so. As the vessel was continuously hove to with the decks awash, there was little to be done on deck except handle the ship and carry out emergency repairs, try to set and again furl the sails. Most of this work required all hands on deck, so the rest of the time the watch on deck was kept busy under the forecastle head, the most sheltered place, at minor jobs such as making sennet, etc., always in their oilskins and sea boots, and ready to work on deck at a moment's notice. I would have enjoyed the heavy work up aloft and on deck, but was kept occupied from early morning to late in the evening at the steward's job. Naturally, I did not know how to organise the work, but was determined that in spite of the weather, the captain, officers and crew should have their meals hot from the galley, even though the cook was working under great difficulties in several feet of water all the time. This is how I managed things. A lifeline, a stout rope stretched around 4 foot above the deck, was made taut from the poop to the forecastle. Dressed in oilskins and sea boots to make myself as watertight as possible, I took a strong cloth into which were knotted the requisite dishes. Carrying the bundle in one hand and the other 3 for the lifeline, I would stand on the poop ladder, waiting for a lull in the waves, and then make a dash towards the galley. With the next sea arriving, I would hang on to the lifeline, since letting go meant over the side with a slim chance of being rescued. The same procedure would be followed again and again until I reached the iron galley door, when the cook would quickly open the lower half to let me in. This opening had to be timed, since if a heavy sea arrived just at that moment, the contents of the galley, cook with pots and pans included, would all have been washed away. Once inside the galley and the door shut, the food would be put into the dishes and tied up for the return journey, which would be made in stages and dashes back to the poop. One very bad day the cook had prepared no food. I rated him roundly, calling him a large, scared, no-good squarehead. He was a Russian. Resenting such remarks, the two of us set to among the pots and pans to settle the difference of opinion. The cook got in a blow which knocked out several of my front teeth, in return for which I obtained a hold of him, set him on his hot stove and kept him there until he yelled for mercy. He lost the seat of his pants. By this time we were both in a bloody mess and soaked with salt water, but feeling the score was even, we cried quits. No experienced steward would have taken all the risks that I did. Either there would have been cold food or the crew would have been called in to help. But this battle against difficult conditions, as far as I was concerned, was an outlet to compensate for lack of sport. The deck was like a playing field. The galley at one end and the poop at the other were the goals, and the grub symbolised the ball, and the great seas were the opposing team. During the time off Cape Horn, with the continual gales, and the deck always awash, on only 2 days did I fail to get the hot food aft. On one of these days, the seas were so big and continuous that the master forbade me to try. The waves had washed over the poop, broken the skylight and flooded the saloon and cabins, and the captain's wife had to stand on the settee with her petticoats gathered round her while I bailed out the water. By now the situation was becoming serious. Fresh water and food stores were running short. The men were developing scurvy and salt water boils. Sails were being lost, and still the Blackbraes could not round the Horn. Serving out the precious supplies of water from the water tanks amidships, just abaft the mainmast, was a difficult and dangerous task. I had to pump the water up by means of a small hand pump into buckets, handed to me by the men, and at the same time be ready at a second's notice to jump up the ropes around the mainmast to dodge the waves, hanging up there until a lull came and I could return to the pump. The men with their buckets had to do the same thing. As the salt water was beginning to seep into the little fresh water that remained, the mate and carpenter said they could build a condenser to obtain fresh water from the sea, and bricks were brought up from the cargo to start operations under the forecastle ahead, the only protected part of the ship. A pipe was required for the condenser, and someone had the bright idea of using the lead speaking tube connecting the poop deck to the captain's cabin. This was accordingly dismantled and made into a coil, but as no thought was given to cleaning it, the first few drops of condensed water that came through tasted of lead tobacco chew and the accumulated unpleasantness of years. Perhaps it was just as well that the same night a heavy sea rushed under the forecastle head and washed away everything, including the homemade condenser. Another of my jobs under the master's instructions was to doctor the men for scurvy. I had read something about this and was rather scared of the complaint. It could cause a man's shin bone to become so soft that it would be dented like a bag of flour. Nearly all the men had a touch of scurvy, some so badly that they could not go on deck. One of the apprentices had rheumatic fever and was unable to leave his bunk. The Blackbraes was continually manoeuvring northwest and southwest, but as soon as she made a little progress, the tremendous seas drove her back. After 5 or 6 weeks of this, one began to think it would last forever, and that life was going to be one continual soaking with sea-water and sliding about among pots and pans. I was keeping a diary of events, and though, like everything else, it became sodden at times, I dried it out and managed to maintain the entries. It is only possible to realise the height and force of the seas off Cape Horn by experiencing them in a vessel of the size and type of the Blackbraes. I was 16 then. Today I'm over 70, but I can still picture those mountainous waves, where one minute the Blackbraes would be down in a trough with a wall of water above her masts, about to descend and utterly swamp her, and the next minute standing nearly vertical, as if climbing the side of a mountain, with the top of the sea breaking over the bow and right across the deck. The tossing went on day after day, night after night, in snow, sleet and rain, and the men lived in oilskins and sea boots. Those were the days before rubber hot water bottles, and the mates on watch kept themselves warm by ordering the apprentices to supply them with fire bricks, heated in the galley oven. The old second mate liked 4 bricks a night, 2 to stand on and 2 for his hands, but this was seldom possible, as the bricks had to be carried along the deck from the galley, and this was a difficult and dangerous journey. Wild weather had now lasted from September the 1st to October the 15th. On October 14th we appeared to be getting well to the west, in about 57 degrees south, 71 degrees west, but on that day were again forced back to the eastward. On October the 15th, on account of sickness, shortage of fresh water and food, and the loss of sails, the master decided it was useless to continue fighting longer, and he set course for the Falkland Islands to refit. What a sigh of relief went up from all on board. It was the general opinion of the old sailors in the forecastle that the captain had given the mate more freedom in handling the Blackbraes than the vessel could have weathered Cape Horn in reasonable time. But of course, this sort of criticism is always to be expected. On October the 23rd, 1899, the Blackbraes arrived off Falkland Islands, but anchored well outside, waiting for a fair wind to enter Port Stanley. There were no tugs. The captain went ashore in the ship's boat, the boatswain being in charge, with 4 sailors, as this required too much skill for the apprentices. Later in the day, the boat returned, loaded with carcasses of fresh mutton and fresh vegetables. From that day, the scurvy patients began to recover, with the exception of 2 men who had to be taken ashore. Now that the Blackbraes was in the Falklands, I was determined to settle this question of the steward's job. I approached the captain after breakfast. "Captain, I don't want to stay as steward any longer. Please arrange for a man from the shore to take over." He replied, "I can't get a steward in the Falkland Islands. You must keep on to San Francisco." I was becoming angry and said, "If you can't get somebody ashore, sir, somebody else must take over. I refuse." Things began to liven up. "You refuse to obey my orders?" "Yes, sir, I will obey orders on deck, but I am not a steward, and did not come to sea to learn to be one." "Get out of this cabin and back to your work," roared the captain. "I will deal with you later." I got out. The mate had heard the row and told me not to worry. A few days later I was told to get back to the half-deck, and was glad to return to my old quarters, although I no longer had a cabin to myself. That same evening the mate called me aft and told me that I was appointed one of the boat's crew under the boatswain, to help make up for some of the time lost by not being on deck. After waiting 2 weeks for a fair wind, the Blackbraes sailed into the inner harbour, but was anchored about 2 miles from the landing stage. The harbour was full of sailing vessels taking shelter for repairs and refitting, all of them having put back from Cape Horn. Some had lost masts, some had deck and hull damage, and some were short of sails, food and water. From the newspapers obtainable, we first heard of the outbreak of the Boer War. There were, of course, no cable communication then with the mainland, and it was a long while before news reached home of the arrival of vessels. In the case of the Blackbraes, when the news of her was sent and received back, it was learned that she had been posted at Lloyd's as overdue and probably lost. I was having a wonderful time in the captain's boat, for there were plenty of excitement. A man from the shore was engaged to do the steward's work. He demanded and obtained 3 times the regular pay for a steward. When I asked the mate what chance I had of the captain keeping his word and rewarding me on arrival at San Francisco, he replied, "Not a chance, my boy. He is going to have a hard time explaining to the owners why he has paid that flunky a mate's wages." The Blackbraes remained in Port Stanley for nearly 4 months, the long delay in refitting being due to the fact that so many vessels required attention and shore labour was scarce. Whenever a vessel was ready for sea and our man was friendly with the other old man, he would take the boat over and we would assist in heaving up anchor to the tune of their chanty. It was on board one such vessel that I met the senior apprentice of the beach bank, who in later years became the marine superintendent in London of the Bank Line. With the boatswain I went on board several hulks and schooners. One, the old Great Britain, was used as a wool hulk. The schooners were employed in carrying wool from Port Stanley to the mainland. On February the 15th, 1900, the Blackbraes prepared to start on her second attempt to round the Horn. Fresh stores had been bought, and to the great delight of the apprentices, the only biscuits obtainable were American crackers. But the captain, no doubt scared at the high prices, and probably it was good to be on deck once more, and the mate carried out his promise and put me on to more interesting work. Soon the Blackbraes was off the Horn again, still finding it tough going, for the north-westerly gales drove her down to 55 degrees south before she could make a westerly course. By March the 5th, 24 days after leaving the Falklands, she was clear of the Horn, although during that time the Horn had been sighted 4 times, including the first attempt. The vessel had been 67 days off the Horn, and 6 months and 5 days since she passed the latitude of the Falklands in the first attempt to beat round the Horn. With the exception of the captain, boatswain, 3 of the boat's crew and myself, no one had left the ship during that period. Before long there were again shortages of food and tobacco. The captain had brought as little as possible in the Falklands, but nearly a month had passed since clearing the Horn, and there was still a long way to go. Rations had to be cut, molasses used in coffee instead of sugar. There was, of course, never any milk, and the fresh meat had been consumed. Tobacco was perhaps the shortage most felt by the men. The usual place to keep a chew of tobacco during meals and such times was in the cap, the result being that the lining became well saturated with tobacco juice. When supplies were low, the lining was cut out to mix with the rapidly diminishing tobacco, and even the cap itself used in this way, if the juice had soaked well through. I was not much of a smoker in those days, but I owned 1/2 pound of plug tobacco and was able to do a bit of trading. Turning down the offer of a ship in a bottle, a knife in pigskin sheath, a leather belt and several other useful articles, I gave way at last and settled for a week's ration of dandy funk, which was a terrible concoction of powdered biscuit, pork fat and molasses. Coming off watch hungry and being unable to satisfy that hunger was not conducive to the study of navigation, but the mate gave me every encouragement. I became keen on chart work and had made myself a chart of the South Pacific Ocean. Finding me busy with this one day, the mate said he would give me the Blackbraes position daily to plot, and told me I could take the positions out of the logbook. It was while looking through the log for the positions of the Cape Horn and finding the positions on my small-scale chart were too close together that I decided to make a large-scale chart. I nosed around for suitable paper and eventually approached the steward, who produced some fine sheets of white cardboard and some thin tissue paper that had lined the cases of American biscuits. On this I made the chart. It aroused considerable interest among some of the crew, and in the end I made over a dozen copies of it for them. We had on board as emergency reserve a fine fat live pig, which was regarded as very precious, even although when killed it would make only about 1 meal for all hands. With the beef, salt pork and tinned meat all used up, orders were given to kill the pig. Word went round that there would be roast pig for dinner, and all hands gathered around the cook and steward. Knives were cleaned of rust and plates washed. The slaughtering was done and roast pork appeared on the menu. But long before San Francisco was reached, that treat was a thing of the past, and once again everyone on board was hungry day after day. But all trials and tribulations were forgotten on anchoring at San Francisco in June 1900. From the local papers it was learned that the Blackbraes had made headlines news with her voyage of 355 days from South Shields to San Francisco, and the front page carried a large reproduction of a photograph of the vessel. It so happened that the sailing vessel Muscle Craig, also at San Francisco, had taken 334 days, coming east about, giving up the Horn in despair after several days trying to weather it. In celebration of these two memorable voyages, a dinner was given at the Seamen's Institute to crews of both vessels, the apprentices from other ships in port serving the table. During the stay in San Francisco, the boarding house masters made persistent efforts to entice the crew away from the ship. The men, however, were determined not to be caught, for as the voyage had been so long and there had been no opportunity of spending in the Falkland Islands, a considerable amount of money was owing to them. Possibly the authorities were backing the boarding house masters, a not unusual thing in those days, since if the men deserted, the owners would keep the wages they should have paid out. One day a member of the crew approached me and asked for the loan of my knife. It was a special one with an 8-inch steel blade, which could not close without opening the catch. When asked why it was wanted, he informed me that the boarding house masters and their bullies were expecting to come on board that night, and the crew intended to fight them off. Handing it over, I wished him good luck. Boarding house masters were not interested in apprentices, as they knew no pay was coming to them. We were told to keep out of the way, and we therefore spent the night on shore. Next morning, when the knife was handed back, I noticed stains on it, and was told it had been very useful in beating the bullies off. The police were of no use in such troubles. Often they were suspected of being in the pay of the boarding house masters, and it was said that the head man held a high position in the city. The Blackbraes lost only one man by desertion during the stay in port. On July the 4th, we witnessed the Independence Day celebrations, and wearing Union flags in our buttonholes joined in the procession. But the Boer War was on, and we were not very popular with a certain section of the people of the town.